Hello, welcome back. We're at Beaver Creek and I'm with Sam Lee, the President and CEO of Northisle Copper and Gold. Sam, good to see you.
Very nice to meet you, Peter.
You too. Just kick things off for those less familiar, brief company overview.
Sure. So Northisle Copper and Gold has a very large copper porphyry with a massive gold credit. We're based in British Columbia on the northern end of Vancouver Island, right beside the historical Island Copper mine that BHP produced for over 24 years. BC, if people don't remember, was one of the leading jurisdictions of copper production in the world. From what I can tell at this point, there's certainly political will and community support to get back to that status level very soon.
Yeah, definitely want to touch on the community support because you're doing something quite unique there. But just before we get into the projects and everything else, just run us through the capital structure of the company.
Sure thing. So we've got a market cap of approximately $40 million. We have a share price of approximately 18 cents. We've got about 200 million shares outstanding. Management and insiders own approximately 17% of the company. Then we have major shareholders that own approximately another 30%, led by a gentleman named Michael Gentile, Donald K. Johnson, each owning approximately 9.9%, and a third unnamed strategic shareholder who owns approximately 9.9%. So within the insiders and shareholders, we own approximately 46% of the company. We have no debt. Our cash we're fully financed for this year's drill program, which we are currently ongoing. We've released our initial results on Monday. We have warrants that are going directly to Michael Gentile and a gentleman named Pierre Baudouin, who were strategic shareholders that came in to an offering 2 years ago. But that's it, and that's very minimal, sub 2 million.
Good, pretty secure position to be in.
Yep.
All right, talk us through the projects. Obviously, also you're Vancouver Island, right? So talk us a little bit about your license area and what it's like to be operating there, what you actually have in the ground at the moment.
Sure. So Vancouver Island, for the people that don't know, is bifurcated pretty much at Campbell River. From anything north of Campbell River is extremely industrial. It's hundreds of years of mining, fishing, forestry. South of Vancouver Island is what people would kind of most commonly associate with, which is Victoria and Tofino, which are quite lovely places to visit. Vancouver Island is obviously part of British Columbia, so it falls under the same permitting structure and the processes that any other mine in British Columbia would have to go through. British Columbia, as I mentioned, in Canada has identified critical metals as being its primary strategy on being relevant in this decarbonization and electrification motif and goal of the world, right? So obviously, we've recognized now that it will cost about $1.2 trillion to come remotely close to establishing our very aspirational 1.5 degree climate change goals by 2050. In order to do that, we will need to spend $1.2 trillion on critical metals, of which $750 billion is copper. Copper is the electrification metal. No matter what battery technology or chemistry you believe in, you can't distribute that power and energy without copper wires. So that is why we're in the situation and predicament we're in today. The short-term proposition is just as compelling within this decade. Their range is probably over 5 to 10 million tons deficit of copper within this decade. And with the mines that are currently been sanctioned, which are the mines that are going to contribute to that deficit or that supply rather, we clearly don't have enough copper to electrify this world. So Canada has taken a very strong position. Canada obviously has announced its critical metals strategy, has carved out $4 billion out of our budget in order to affect the strategy, and now it's going through an action plan led by each province to figure out the plan to make this proposition reality. And so we are expecting the Deputy Minister of Mines and Energy is here today at the conference. We're expecting that announcement to come out hopefully sometime in January. Spoiler alert, I think that 100% it's going to be generated based on establishing very strong community and support and consent-driven projects. First Nations obviously being a primary driver of support that the mining industry and quite frankly, our country in general are looking to seek out. And that's exactly the consent-based approach that we have preempted as part of our project.
Yeah, so before we go on to that consent-based approach, it's quite novel and you're the first ones to be able to do this, I believe in the world, but especially in Canada. But first of all, what have you got in the ground at the moment? Because it's porphyry copper gold, yep. But something that's quite unique about it is it's near surface, so you're not having to do these huge, very expensive drill holes as often as, say, other people in Chile or something like that.
Correct.
Which is a great benefit. But tell us about what's actually in the ground
Sure.
at the moment, and what's the actual, I guess, what's the strategy moving forward? Because there's a few core assets here within the same license area that look very promising, right?
Of course. So the project is defined by a resource of approximately 900 million tons, of which there's approximately 60% of that is copper, 65% of it is copper, approximately 30-ish% of it is gold, and the rest are other critical metals, including molybdenum and uranium. Excuse me. And so the grades, this is a typical porphyry in BC. It's low grade, high tonnage, so copper equivalent grade of approximately 4.41%, which stands quite well across all of the current producing copper mines in British Columbia. The preliminary economic assessment that we've established yields approximately $1.1 billion after-tax net present value, using $3.25 copper prices and $16.50 gold prices. The IRR is approximately 19.1% after tax, and this is across a 22-year mine life. So it's a very, very significant and attractive IRR for such a long-dated mine life. So the potential around the entire 50-kilometer district, for which we have tenements on, is really to create or address the question, this is a very meaningful copper project with a massive gold credit. It can be a starter pit to something much, much larger, something much more generational. Obviously 22-year mines today, but when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about what's important to communities and First Nation groups, it's how sustainable can this mine be? How can it not only touch one generation, but multiple generations? So our objective from an exploration perspective is to address that question, to ensure that this can go on for 50, 75, 100 years mine that can be a generational, not only a generational, but a multi-generational opportunity.
How are you looking at it at the moment? Because obviously, just from the capex on the large sort of 22-year projects is quite large, and you were obviously mentioning a starter pit there, which I think, to be honest, I think a lot of people do like the sound of, because it's a lot more achievable for a junior.
Yes.
To obviously raise that type of funds or get a project partner in, and actually get there, rather than obviously something that's going to blow the bank. So. Right. At the moment, is the idea, because you were actually just mentioning some drilling there.
Yes.
They look positive. It looks like it does support this theory of a starter pit, right?
Correct. So it's a great question, and the answer really is based on the eye of the beholder, right? Yeah. So I agree. There are people out there that think that a $1 billion capex, $1 billion NPV project is quite onerous for certainly a small company like ourselves. But I come from a world, my background is I'm a metallurgist by training, but I spent 20 years at Banco and Dealers. I ran CIBC's global mining practice out of Vancouver. $1 billion projects are actually not that big, and in fact they're considered starter pits, right? So I think the majors would all agree, the incumbents would suggest that what we have is a starter pit. And the question that we need to answer is a starter pit to what? So what is that multi-generational opportunity that could attract a much, much larger project or a company that would be interested in such a project? And so, as we start thinking through these strategic initiatives, we all know we have to be good, right? To be lucky. But we believe in order to be good, we have to have as many options and appeal to as much of the population as possible as it relates to the opportunities. And so the opportunity that we have defined for the market and for our stakeholders and landholders is really kind of a Mount Milligan size. It's a Gibraltar size. It's a Red Chris size which is a very interesting size for most people. How do you then create the proposition around what you've just said, which entails this very valid question that it's perhaps too big for a company of our size? Well, there's an area just north of this project, 3 kilometers north, called Northwest Expo, where we're seeing gold grades, high-grade gold occurrences within the copper porphyry, and these gold grades are approximately 4 to 5 times higher than what we're currently seeing in this overall footprint of our resource estimate. And so what is the significance of that? Well, it's quite significant because it does then allow you to then contemplate something that can bridge a smaller project, lower capital intensity, higher IRR project into a much larger 22-year billion-dollar CapEx, billion-dollar NPV mine. So that's our goal, that's our objective. All of our KPIs are now based on this goal that we've set out, and the first step of that goal, to achieve that goal, is to develop a resource around this Northwest Expo, this 4 to 5 times higher grade gold zone within the copper porphyry. So we've completed now 2 phases of 3 drilling to obviously support this theory and support the resource estimate, hopefully to come out later on this year. We are currently drilling the 3rd phase of this program, and so by the end of October, we should have all of our assays in to establish an initial resource for this area. And then of course the step after that is to apply the economics and strip ratios and recoveries to show ourselves in the market that this can in fact be that 10-year high enriched gold production, over 100,000 ounce production with a little bit of copper, that bridges you into a 20-year massive proposition of 100 million pounds of copper a year and 100,000 ounces of gold a year. So this entire proposition now has turned from a 22 proposition to well over a 30-year proposition with a much higher margin project, lower capital intensity project at the beginning. So just to give a perspective of what we have drilled, we just released our results on Monday. And that again is phase 2 of 3 phases. That supports grades of between 1 to 1.6 over grams per ton of gold equivalent over 100 meters, right? So this is within the porphyry. We see lots of continuity, and we're on track to obviously define a very significant envelope of resource within that.
Obviously, I wouldn't mind touching on Pemberton Hills because obviously there's a lot of work being done at Northwest Expo. You've got the main ore body that obviously you're sort of understanding at the moment. This looks like a very prospective target. How much of a priority is it for you, or is that something that's now on the back burner whilst you look at this starter pit option?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's absolutely not on the back burner. To put things in perspective, this is the 3rd leg to the stool that I mentioned before in terms of providing as many options and being relevant to as many people in this population as possible. And Pemberton Hills, the unique nature of it is that it's a lithocap. Currently, we've defined it as a lithocap. It's 6.5 kilometer by 1.5 kilometer lithocap. And for those that don't know, British Columbia typically is known for having lower grade porphyries versus the rest of the world. And part of our belief is that it's because you don't see a whole lot of lithocaps in British Columbia. In fact, you don't see any in British Columbia, and that's because it's been eroded away. And if you could imagine a cap, a structure that actually caps this upflow zone of high temperature, acidic, high pH, low pH magma containing minerals, if you don't have a cap or if it's eroded away, it just dissipates and it kind of disseminates into lower grade material. And so that's our belief around British Columbia and generally what's happened. But obviously we still have high enough grades to mine successfully and economically. So what we have at Pemberton Hills is a enormous lithocap, which you would only see in regions predominantly in South America like Chile or in Peru, very high copper producing nations with high grades, and perhaps with that effect of that capping nature of concentrating the grades in that area. And so what we've done is we've spent about $4.5 million to date to understand the nature of the cap, obviously, but also understand the positioning of the cap. And one of the biggest revelations we've had over the last couple of years with our partners and our people at Emera and Codes, is that we now believe very strongly that the system is tilted on a relatively acute angle. And if you imagine what a porphyry looks like, think about a mushroom, with the cap being kind of the mushroom, and of course the upflow zones and the high mineralized zones being part of the stem. If you were to rotate it at an acute angle, geometrically, that area that you're looking for, the stem, becomes closer to the surface, right? And so whilst we see some really interesting grades coming out of these projects in Chile, obviously the Filos of the world and the Natex of the world, we're seeing them at very significant depth, plus 1,000 meters, in some cases plus 2,000 meters, right? So what we've done through our program, $4.5 million program to date, is we've defined a 14-hole discovery drill program, so an exploration program aimed at discovery for obviously the source of the porphyry. And the expectation geometrically, obviously nothing's perfect in this world and we can have faulting, but the expectation is that what we're looking for is closer to the surface. So the holes would go initially no farther down than 750 meters. Good. So I think that's a really interesting proposition. Obviously, this is, as you could imagine, a very large drill program because it is, at this point, buried. It's a reasonably deep porphyry, and to be able to fully define it would take many, many drill holes, even before, beyond the 14 holes that we're using just to discover this. So we are partly financed for the 14 holes. We're fully permitted, 5-year MIABs, as I mentioned before, through the good work that we've been doing with our First Nation partners and the government. We've expedited our permitting process in a way that it only took us 14 weeks to receive 5-year MIAB permits, including Pemberton Hills. So we're fully permitted for that program for the next 5 years. And I guess at this point, the decision point is, do we want to advance it ourselves? Do we want to advance it with ourselves plus a partner? And that will come into fruition over the next 12 months.
I guess before you bring a partner in, it would ease people a lot if there was a discovery hole though first, right, to make sure that this was there. Would you imagine?
I think ease would be a very, very interesting way to put it. I think it would be.
It would be transformational for you as well.
It would be a transformational.
And perhaps you wouldn't even need a partner at that point.
Well, I think that the nature of these types of deposits, and the closest analogy I could think of is like an OT, right, or Oitoigu, which is essentially an open pit that essentially runs for the first 20, 25 years as the underground gets developed, right? And that's analogous to what we have. We've got the open pit, as I said. It's kind of almost a starter pit, if you will, but the question is starter pit to what? Something that's underground, something that will take a much longer time to define and to develop. And quite frankly, it would be a Herculean effort to develop something as big as an OT on the island, right? So, so I think realistically speaking, there will be the need for a partner. We're seeing a lot of these processes today around partnership structures for much, much smaller propositions, right? So I'm not, I certainly don't want to fool ourselves or anybody else to make the people believe that this is never going to be partnered. But the question is always at the right time.
Exactly,
what is the right time to find the partner? Exploration comes with a tremendous amount of risk. Because we have such a prospective targeted area around Northwest Expo, if we can define this envelope by this year and create another economic starter pit to what we currently have, it's all of it is at surface at this point. We've seen continuity going down dip, up dip to the surface. Those are the type of exploration opportunities that we can fully engage in ourselves and really bring value to. And the question, as I pointed out before, 40% of our shareholders are owned by 4 people. So the question always comes down to, is the dilution worth the outcome, right? And so I can certainly provide comfort to say that this has been debated severely in the boardroom as to what is the right time to introduce a partner. And I think either way, I'm quite confident that we will be advancing Pemberton Hills over the next 12 months.
Vancouver Island, obviously there is a perception that it's relatively tough to actually permit a mine on the island. What's your view on that?
Look, I can understand the perception, but I can absolutely say emphatically that the perception is not reality. Vancouver Island is no different than the rest of British Columbia as it relates to permitting. We, as I mentioned, are on the northern end of Vancouver Island, so we're about 500 kilometers away from Victoria. And as I said, historically, the north end of the Vancouver Island has been a very industrially focused area. And so, we have received nothing but support from local politicians, including the local MLA, Michelle Babchuk, who is also the NDP party whip for the governing party in the province. We've received multiple supportive public comments from the Minister of Energy and Mining and Low Carbon Innovation. The Deputy Minister is here today supporting our cause. In fact, will be a panel moderator at 9 o'clock on our Thursday presentation, so I invite everyone to listen to that, to hear the support that we get. And I think the level of support is not only predicated on where we are and the rich history of industry. Over 20% currently of employment on the north end of the island, it comes from extractive industries. And when BHP Island Copper Mine was in production, it would have been well over 80%. So, but it's not only the rich history, but it's also the consent-based approach that we are taking with our First Nation partners around how we go about getting our permits, about how we recognize that we need their consent prior to going into the permitting process, and then having that level of confidence really resonating with the government. So for example, in British Columbia, we went through the permitting process after receiving consent from our First Nation partners, a process that typically takes about 6 months to 12 months to get, 6 months to 2 years to get a 5-year Maya permits. It took us about 14 weeks. So this is a really important piece of evidence around the consent-based approach that we have progressed as part of our overall objective of permitting, not only exploration permits, but obviously development on the island.
Good, Sam, thank you for your time.
Yeah, very much.
Cheers.
Thank you.